We each have choices to make in our lives and in our work. On what basis will you make those choices in your life and work? Today, 2 steps that can help you be more intentional in the choices that you make. Hi, I'm Rich Harwood. Welcome to another edition of Harwood Half Hour, live from our studios in downtown Bethesda. It's great to have you here. Shoot me a message and let me know that you can hear me and where you're calling in from. And here's a question I'd like you to think about as we go through today's episode. What makes it hard to be intentional in the choices that you make in your life and work? What makes it difficult or hard to be intentional in the choices that you make? You know, when I was thinking about today, it reminded me of a question that so many people ask me when they meet me. They say, you know, you've been training these public innovators and change agents and leaders for 30 years now. What's the most difficult part of doing that? And I think they always expect some really sophisticated answer, something that has to do with funding or relevance or whatever it may be. And, you know, it comes down to something really basic is what I tell them. The most difficult thing is to get people to make choices, to get each of us, to get myself, to get you, to make the choices that we need in order to be effective, to be relevant, to be significant in the life of our communities, and to make our life filled with purpose and meaning. You know, I think one of the reasons why it's so hard to make those choices is that we get kind of lost along the way. You know, we don't want to make choices because we want to be all things to all people. We want people to like us. We want to be likable, right? We all feel that. We all wrestle with that. We don't want to make choices because we think we need to stay on the treadmill to keep raising dollars, because if we get off the treadmill and pause or reflect on what we're actually doing, that something bad's going to happen to us. And so we keep going. We don't make the choice to alter our behavior or actions. We don't make choices because we have programs or activities that we want to pursue, and somehow or another we think that if we stop and make an alternate choice or go in a different direction, that something wrong is going to happen, or maybe our funders won't support us, or maybe people won't like us, back to that original notion that I put out there. And so we don't make choices, or we kind of make half a choice. We don't go the whole way. And then, of course, we don't make choices because we harbor certain doubts or fears about something. And so I don't know if this is true for you. I know it's true for a lot of people. It's true for me sometimes. You know, when you have doubts or fears, you become paralyzed. You become frozen in place. It's hard to make choices. Sometimes it's actually even hard to think about the choices and to work through them in your own mind. And then sometimes we don't want to make choices because, well, we don't want to lose control. And by maintaining where we are, by maintaining a tight grip on what we're doing, by doing continually more what we've already been doing from before, we don't have to worry about losing control. We maintain a sense that we are in control, and that becomes really important to us. You know, I was just in Montana recently as part of my national speaking tour, which, by the way, just to make a really quick plug, I hope you'll bring me to your community as part of this speaking tour, because I think it's important. It's an important time in our country, and we need a different message about how we can build a more hopeful society. But I'll come back to that another time. But I was in Montana on this national speaking tour, and I was with a group of folks, maybe 50 or 60 folks, and I had asked them to break up into small groups, and they had topics like, do we still believe in the innate capabilities of people in our communities? Another small group was, how do we deal with the civic stains, the stains on our civic fabric, which in Montana happen to deal with issues around Native Americans? Another one was, how do we embrace the challenges that we confront in our professional and personal lives, particularly those challenges that scare us or strike fear into us? And so these were all different small groups that people were talking simultaneously in. And it's interesting, when I pulled everyone back into the large group for a plenary session to discuss what they had talked about, there was this common theme that emerged really, really quickly that had to do with the choices that people faced in each of these conversations. And as I asked people about what they were confronting, they said, in my own conversation, in each of these individual conversations, people reported out that we make all sorts of assumptions about people's innate capabilities, or we make all sorts of assumptions about the stains on our civic fabric and whether or not people are really willing to talk about them or not. We make all sorts of assumptions about whether or not we'll embrace these tough challenges before us. And these assumptions, people told me, they drive the choices that we make. They drive the choices. That conversation led to a conversation that so often these assumptions are actually rooted in biases. We have biases so that maybe when we look at someone, we assume that they will or won't want to talk about something, which is a kind of bias. Or maybe when we look at someone and we know what they do for a living, or maybe if they don't have a job, we make all sorts of assumptions, in this case about their innate capabilities to contribute to their community. And then they said sometimes these assumptions which can lead to biases can also lead to prejudice, that we make decisions based on prejudice. We make choices based on prejudice. And so they said that these choices, they actually begin to shape what we do. They gave me another example that when they're talking to people about a tough political issue, I remember a woman sitting to my right, a couple of tables away, and she said, I realized that when I talk to someone about a tough issue, like when they come into the library, she happened to be a librarian, when they come into the library and they ask me something, all of a sudden in my mind, there's this kind of cascading effect about, I make all sorts of assumptions and biases about who they are and what they believe, and before you know it, this entire discussion has sort of run away from us. And prevents us from engaging with one another. And so in that case, what happens with our choices is that they begin to be driven by our attitudes. They get driven by sort of ingrained assumptions about things. They get driven by conventional wisdom that we believe we're supposed to believe in. They get driven by our history. They get driven by external pressures, like the example of the fundraising point I was making earlier. All of these things drive and shape what we do and drive and shape the choices that we make, right? And so the question is, if all of these things are in operation, if we're wondering how is it that we don't be all things to all people, because we know that doesn't work very well. How is it that we make sure that we're making choices about programs and initiatives and strategies that are more relevant and significant in the life of our communities as opposed to being on autopilot? How is it that we don't assume that people don't have innate capabilities because of what they do for a living, or the color of their skin, or their creed, or their religion, or whatever it may be? What's the alternative? How do you get out of those ruts that we find ourselves in, those grooves that sort of keep shaping what we do and driving our behaviors and actions and thoughts and even feelings and emotions? I think what we need to do is we need to become more intentional in the choices that we make. We need to adopt a greater sense of intentionality. And in adopting that, I believe we'll make better choices. And here's the other thing I believe will happen, that we will begin to create in our own individual lives a greater sense of purpose and meaning. We will feel as though we are on a stronger sense of mission, that we are moving towards something larger than ourselves that has some greater sense of purpose and meaning. And I think what so many of us want in public life today is this greater sense of purpose and meaning. I think we want to be more effective and more impactful. And in order to do that, what I'm suggesting is we need to become more intentional. You need to become more intentional. And when we act with greater intentionality, when we adopt a posture of greater intentionality, it means that we have to make more discernments more discernments about what's happening around us. We can't just be on autopilot. It means that we need to make more judgments about what's important. Again, we can't just be on autopilot. And it means ultimately that we have to make choices, that simply trying to be all things to all people isn't going to cut it. We got to get real with ourselves. We got to square up with reality. And we got to understand what reality is, which requires making discernments. We have to make judgments about what's important in that reality and what people want. And we're going to have to make more choices. There are no guarantees. There are no guarantees that when we do this, we're going to be more successful. But what I can tell you is that it increases the likelihood that we'll be more effective, that we'll be more relevant, that will be more significant in the life of our communities, that will engender within ourselves a greater sense of purpose and meaning. But for this to happen, you're going to need to step forward. You're going to need to take a step forward into community life, into your own life. You're going to need to make yourself visible in a sense and say, here I am. I am visible. I am present. I am ready to be more intentional. I am ready to lean into the challenges that I face. And ultimately, I am ready to take action. So what are steps you can do? What are steps you can take? How can you become more intentional? How can you exercise greater intentionality? And so I want to make just 2 points today. I'm going to keep it really simple, really simple. Obviously, it can be a lot more complex and complicated than this. But honestly, after doing this work for 30 years, I don't think it has to be. I think we've got to get back to basics and focus on things that are really important. So 2 key steps for you in terms of exercising greater intentionality in your life and in your work. Ready? Number 1, wakefulness. Right, wakefulness. I think we've got to be more wakeful in who we are and how we bring ourselves into the world. Being wakeful means, and having a sense of wakefulness means that we're awake, we're present, we're attuned to what's happening around us and to those around us. We are attentive to what's happening around us and to those around us. It means that, in a sense, our eyes are wide open and our heart is enlarged. It means that we're here, right? We're accounting for ourselves. We're present. And the reason why I say this is that think about the story I was telling you about Montana, what happened there in these conversations. When I press people in this conversation about what they were doing and why they were doing it, about these assumptions and biases and prejudices and the lack of choices or the implicit choices that they were making. They said to me, no, Rich, essentially we have turned inward. We have hunkered down. Our eyes are not open. Our eyes are down. Our hearts are not enlarged. We're protecting our hearts from others, right? And they were thinking that they could make choices about things without knowing very much about them. They could assume what Native Americans want. They could assume that the person who didn't hold a good job, quote unquote, a good job, didn't have innate capabilities, or that if someone dressed a certain way, they could assume something about them. Being intentional, having greater intentionality, means that there is a greater wakefulness in each of us, in you, that we are not hunkered down and turned inward. We are actually turned outward. We are awake. We are attuned. We are attentive. We are present. And only by being those things can we actually be able to make discernments about what's actually happening around us. Only then can we make judgments about what's really important and where we want to put a stake in the ground. Only then can you make good choices about what you need to do and what your organization needs to do and what your community collectively might need to do. This kind of wakefulness, just last point on this kind of wakefulness, think about it. It's in direct opposition to what we see happening all across the country right now. I want to say the crap that's happening all across the country right now, the polarization, the sense of demonizing one another, the sense of thinking about the other, the sense of shunting the stranger, right? All of these things take us turning our back on one another, not being attuned to one another, not being attentive to one another, not being awake and present with one another. And intentionality, the type of intentionality I'm talking about in terms of this wakefulness, it requires you to step forward, not to step back. It requires you, think about it, to step into things, not to step away from things. So that's point number one. Got to have a greater wakefulness among us. We've got to have a greater wakefulness within us. You need a greater wakefulness within yourself. Point number two is moral accountability. That intentionality requires not just wakefulness. It requires a kind of moral accountability within each of us, on the part of each of us. Now, here's the thing. Sometimes when I say this, people say, well, you know, I can't control everything that's happening around me. There's way too much happening. It's way beyond me. You know, Rich, you're asking me to do, you know, the undoable. You know, maybe Superman or Catwoman or someone can do these things, but not me, not in the world I live in. And here's the thing. None of us control everything around us. But what I'm asking you to do is to take a moral accountability for those things you can control, for those things that are in your sphere of influence, to exercise the power over those things you can exercise power over, and to be accountable for those things. And here's why moral accountability is so important. It suggests that the actions that we take, the choices that we make, they don't come free of strings attached. That each of the choices we make have consequences. They have ramifications. They may have costs. And that in being intentional, what this means is that we take into account the consequences our actions may have on others, the consequences and ramifications our actions may have on our communities. It's funny, you know, in Montana, when this came up and they were talking about, in a sense, not making choices, and that their choices were driven, in a sense, by these biases and assumptions and even prejudices in some cases. They said that their choices that they were making actually had consequences. They said this really quickly. They said to me, and they said, and more importantly, to one another, they said, by having these biases and assumptions and prejudices, it means that we forfeit the opportunity to tap into the capabilities and capacities of fellow neighbors here in Montana, that we forfeit that opportunity. They said that when we make the choices that we're making in the ways in which we're making them, we are in essence saying we're going to keep other people at arm's length, that we're not going to let them get too close to us, that we're not going to let them touch us, that then we're not going to let us see that we are in some common enterprise called community, that we will in fact build a wall between and among us, which means that we can't come together and act collectively on our shared problems and seek to achieve our shared aspirations. They said that when we make these assumptions, when we hold these biases, when we act with these prejudices, by definition, we are closing off the conversations we need to have with one another. Think about it. That when someone says something to you, I remember another person in this Montana conversation said to me that immediately what I start to think about is that they belong to one political party or another. And that when I think about that, I not only think about the topic we're talking about, now all of a sudden I make assumptions about all sorts of other beliefs that they hold, all sorts of other positions on issues that they hold, all sorts of prejudices now that I'm going to assume that they hold about me or about some other group in our community that I'm concerned about or affiliated with. And when that cascading effect kicks in our conversation, simply because one person said one thing to us, we immediately close off the possibility to have conversations with them about what we need to know about the topic we're talking about, and perhaps some other topics that we may need to discuss together. And so we need to become more intentional, which is going to require that you and I, those of us who care about this, which I hope is everyone, that we show up differently. To be intentional, to exercise greater intentionality in your life and in your work, requires that you show up and show up differently. It requires that you step forward, as I mentioned before. It requires that you make yourself visible, that you are present, you are here. It requires that you show up and lean into things, not turn away from them. And it requires that you show up ready and willing and able to make choices, even though those choices will be hard sometimes, even though those choices may cause you some discomfort, even though those choices may even cause you some sense of pain and loss, that we're still going to have to show up and make these choices, right? And so here's my hope for you in terms of being intentional. My hope for you today is that you will seize the intrinsic power that you have within yourself to step forward, to become more intentional, to think of yourself in that intentionality as a co-creator of the communities and the world around you. And that you dare to hope that by being more intentional, you can actually create a more hopeful community and a more hopeful society with others. And so thanks for joining me today. This is another edition of Harwood Half Hour. Remember, it's our 30th anniversary this year that we're celebrating. And in that celebration, this is not about tooting our own horn or the things that we've achieved over the last 30 years. We're taking our 30th anniversary as an opportunity to rededicate ourselves and recommit ourselves to supporting the efforts, your efforts in your communities to build a more hopeful society. As you know, our work has spread to all 50 states in the US and to 40 different countries. It's rooted in the philosophy of civic faith and the practice of turning outward. I hope you'll go to our website to get some of the materials and resources we have that can support you in your efforts. And lastly, starting in 2 weeks, we'll be doing Harwood Half Hour episodes on Wednesday afternoons at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, as opposed to Thursday afternoons. And I hope you'll join us then. Until then, be well. I look forward to seeing you again. Thanks so much.